Okay, hello everyone. Good morning if you are Central Time or west of there, and good afternoon if you are on the East Coast. Welcome to our 2021 Spring Webinar Series. I'm Allison. I will introduce myself in just a moment. Before we get started, we've got a few housekeeping slides. All right, so for this webinar, please enter your questions into the Q&A. So you'll notice there's a chat and a Q&A. So please use the Q&A. That is what we will use to answer questions at the end. If there's anything really pressing, I have a moderator in the back. Chris Haugen is here with me, and he will interject if there's anything that's really pressing or if anything is going wrong technology-wise. This webinar is being recorded, and the link will be sent out after the webinar, and it will also be posted on our website if you are looking for that. The webinar is worth 1 ISA CEU, so you should have been able to register your ISA certification number when you signed up, but if you did not, or if you're not sure, please enter your ISA number in the Q&A right now. So your name and your ISA number. This will also be worth 1 Pennsylvania pesticide credit. The link will be at the end to enter your license number to get you credit for that. So without further ado, we will get started. So we're calling this one Lessons Learned, the Chicagoland Emerald Ash Borer Story, a Company's Perspective. And I'll explain a little bit more as I get into this. So I'm going to cover who am I, why am I here, why do I have any credibility talking about this, give you a brief history of the emerald ash borer kind of timeline and story in Chicagoland, and then how that applies to you depending on where you are geographically moving forward with emerald ash borer. The basic overview, sort of toolbox approach and treatment methods that are available will hit that very high level. Discuss what the practical concerns and impacts of emerald ash borer are, like why do we need to consider the importance, the importance of ash trees and what emerald ash borer can do to communities and why that will alter our management plans. I'll talk about where we were at the time back then, about 10 years ago at this point, and I was in the field from the trenches. We'll talk about tree removal crew, so tree crew as a plant healthcare tech, and then as a consulting arborist, what those sort of conversations looked like. And I'll highlight some case studies, personal case studies of mine. So homeowner and municipal case studies. We'll talk about the then versus now, why that matters. So there's products and equipment that have changed a lot, and we've learned a lot too. So basically the whole purpose is to have some larger takeaways to help you guys all create the best possible management plans, especially in markets that don't have emerald ash borer yet. So really the purpose of this presentation is to give you a broad overview of some very practical lessons learned from my consulting arborist perspective when it comes to managing EAB. And then we'll address a little bit on the municipal side, but I do want to mention we are hoping to run a webinar series in conjunction with Society of Municipal Arborists to hone in on some of that stuff. So if you have specific municipal questions, feel free to ask away. And if you have specific suggestions for that, I would love to have that input as well. All right, so that's me. I'm Alison Harrell. I'm the arborologist with Rainbow Tree Care Scientific Advancements, the hosts of this webinar. An arborologist is kind of a made-up word to describe my role. I provide technical plant healthcare protocol training and support for all of Rainbow's clients. We help with research and development, and then I do a lot of other stuff, webinars. You guys have seen me by now. I have a bachelor's in biology from Valparaiso University and a master's in environmental science from Indiana University School of Public and Environmental Affairs, where I focused on urban forestry and, you guessed it, emerald ash borer and planning for such. At this point, I've got about 10 years of experience, including forestry, urban forestry research, plant healthcare application, sales, and then now what I do here. So I don't know, I didn't get the geographic breakdown of who is all on this webinar, but anybody in the Midwest and the East Coast has already really lived through the EAB experience. But I will say I'm hoping there are a few people who are in markets more like Denver or Kansas City or even West Coast. Oh, I didn't mention this. I was based in Chicago for 10 years, but now I live out in Portland, Oregon. So I'm hoping there are some West Coast people out here who are thinking about getting their EAB plants together, even though it has not made it over the French range yet. So back to what I was saying, my timing into the industry was very unique. I finished my undergraduate program right as emerald ash borer was sort of peaking in the Midwest. So I did my work in an urban forestry lab in Indiana right when EAB was sweeping through Michigan and Ohio, but I had not personally seen it yet. I was working on the planning component of it. And then I moved to Chicago and I got in as a plant healthcare tech and a groundsman, basically right as things were starting to heat up. So then I moved into sales right as we were sort of on the back end of things and having really interesting discussions on that. So I'm hoping that I will be able to share some useful things for you. My goal is to set the stage and go from there. So it's a part of Rainbow's commitment to urban forestries, tree canopies, highlight the problems that Chicago dealt with their EAB management plan, and hopefully to give you insight into creating a new future so you can see the tools that we have and learn from our mistakes and learn from the earliness of things in the Midwest so you all don't also have to struggle. All right, so it feels like EAB is a little bit of old news, but we'll go through brief history and background. So EAB was first confirmed in Michigan and Ohio in the early 2000s. From a Chicagoland side of things, first parts of Chicagoland, EAB was detected around 2005. And then by about 2010, when I was finishing school, the entirety of Chicagoland was confirmed to have it. So I'm just going to take you through a quick graphic to the early 2000s. By 2004, it had spread quite a bit. 2006, oops, sorry, clicked too fast. 2008, there we see Chicagoland has officially got a decent amount. And then by 2010, it's completely covered. And you can see this moves relatively quickly, right? We all know this. But here's the interesting component of this is typically it's like year 6 or 7 when you actually start to see exponential ash mortality due to high pressure of this pest. So in a lot of cases, you don't even see the signs or symptoms of emerald ash borer until it's already been in the area for a few years. So this is why we need to get thinking about this. So if you look at this curve on the very top right corner, Ohio and Michigan were already up there. Like they were already past the that curve by the time that they detected it there, and they were just like dealing with mass removals. Chicago was kind of in the middle, so between those two dots when they discovered, which meant there was actually time to address management, but not a lot, because as you see, as the population builds, ash mortality, the percent of mortality of trees goes quickly. So depending on where you are, like Denver, for instance, still kind of bottom left-ish. Boulder has gotten towards the middle, and then like the West Coast is way at the bottom. Places like Kansas City, again, a little bit in the middle. And then if you're on here and you're from the Midwest, I bet you're just coming here to get a CEU, but that's cool. You guys are way past this. You guys are way past the top right corner. And you're either dealing with it or you're not. So you're either dealing with it and treating trees, or you have a lot of dead trees, or you've removed a lot of dead trees. There's really not a lot of in between. So looking back, where were we at the time? So like I said, started in the field about 2010-ish. So when I started, there was no conclusive long-term data of effectiveness of any treatments. So you guys all know, hopefully, as arborists, there are actually quite a few different effective treatments against emerald ash borer. But Obviously, because there was only a couple years of data at the time, there was really only kind of trial-based data, and there wasn't enough, time to have actually conclusive, statistically profound data. So we were just kind of throwing a lot of the chemicals that we had in hopes that they would work. And they did. There's quite a few that do work, and we're going to talk about those in a moment. But it was really hard to budget and get a plan in action quickly. So going back to my previous point, we know EB, abamectin, benzoate did show really good efficacy against emerald ash borer if treated before signs of canopy dieback. Now we use like a 30% marcator, and again, I'll get into that a little bit, but we knew that abamectin benzoate could work, but it was the fact that you had to spend a lot of money up front for the chemicals. You had to get the crews in order, and that takes a lot of time. As we know, plant healthcare technicians are hard to find, sometimes can be hard to train, especially because we didn't really know what we were doing. But a lot of times we got into the conversation where a lot of trees were already showing signs of decline. So cities and homeowners weren't willing to spend the money on those treatments, especially without that long-term data. And then another point that I do want to make is in 2013, national press brought in a lot of issues surrounding neonicotinoids for treatment. And actually that was in relation to something that happened here where I live in Portland, where there's an improper use of dinotefuran on lindens that resulted in the kill of tens of thousands of honeybees. So there was a ton of press. Everyone was really concerned about using neonics. So that would be things like imidacloprid and dinotefuran. So even though abamectin benzoate is non-neonic, and it is the most effective product out there, people were still very wary of things like that. So why does it matter? What are the practical concerns? So of course, the economic concerns, this is first and foremost on a lot of people's minds, the cost to treat or to remove and replace. So it can be expensive to treat if you're talking about like large volumes of trees, especially large trees, but it's also extremely expensive to remove and replace. So you'll have to do a cost benefit. So for homeowners and municipalities, if they were not incurring a cost as they're part of their normal annual budget, the discussion of, what money you need to throw at these things to treat them. So how much money does it cost to treat over a period of time? And what will that look long-term versus removal and replacement? That's a big upfront cost, but then maybe you're not looking at costs down the line. And I think if you guys were on the webinar with Dr. Sadoff last week or the week before, he talked about that quite a bit. Of course, the environmental concerns are very real. There's a ton of tree benefits, and I think that goes kind of glossed over. Like we all learn in school that trees are good because they provide air, but it's so much more than that, right? Yes, air, but also carbon sequestration, energy savings on your buildings from shade, stormwater management is probably the biggest monetary and also environmental impact, and then erosion control, so, and many, many others as well. Public safety, so in the picture that's up there, that's a very real example of how things happen, but the danger of dead trees, because dead ash trees get extremely brittle and they must be removed relatively quickly, or you're kind of on the hook for legal negligence, not to mention safety to your climbers. So I ran into this a lot when I was on tree crew, where we just had to walk away from jobs because if you couldn't get a crane or a spider lift in there, and the tree was too far gone, you knew it wasn't going to be safe to climb and it wasn't worth it. So then what does that homeowner do, right? Let it fall. I actually had a homeowner who removed a garage specifically to have a tree removed. So it's a lot of things to consider there. Anyway, there's always a political concern. Whose responsibility is it? Is it park district? Is it your Department of Forestry? Is it your homeowner? And then of course, there's always negative perceptions involved with removing live trees that appear healthy. Like it looks bad. It also looks bad if you let a bunch of trees die and then you have to go and remove this. And I'm going to talk about this, my tree crew experience, but I was on the Humboldt Park tree removal in Chicago. So that's a huge park there. It was several thousand trees that we removed, and every single day, the public concern and the political side of things, who do we call? Who's our alderman? Why are you guys doing that? All of those things, those are very, very real concerns. And then of course, as a homeowner, you guys could probably all relate. Losing shade, losing property value. Maybe you're going to choose to treat your tree, but say that ends up being an extra $200 a year that you need to budget into your things. And if your budget is tight, that can make or break, you know, what you're deciding on. A lot of people have sort of intrinsic value to their tree. So maybe it was an ash that was planted when their child was born. You have to always take those things into consideration. And then this is a more of an urban, like a hyper urban concern, but in big, densely populated metro areas, so I'm talking about Chicago specifically, but it a lot of times would be the circumstance where there was only a singular tree on the property, and that was an ash tree. So they would say, we bought this house because of this tree. It was a singular, you know, autumn purple white ash in the backyard. And I get it, those are beautiful, they're great shade trees, they turn beautiful colors in the fall, and that was something really valuable. So those are conversations that you kind of need to be ready to have, especially if you live in a really densely populated area. And then public health, this is glossed over, but there's a lot of benefits to having trees: cardiovascular health, respiratory health, things like that. So if you want to get into more on that, there's been a ton of publications in the American Journal of Preventative Medicine. Jeffrey Donovan and Dr. Novak are two really interesting scientists to read their data if you have any interest in that. Okay, so common myths we still struggle with today, but it was much, much worse back then. So common myth was that removing trees as they die was a viable EAB management strategy, but the reality is the removals are on the beetle's schedule. This is not on your tree crew schedule. So typically what will happen is all of the trees die at once. That will leave cities with thousands to millions of dollars of removals. They won't have enough equipment, they won't have enough labor, and then can leave you vulnerable to safety and liability issues. Another myth: tree removal slow EAB spread. It doesn't. The pest continues to find food sources. So any untreated trees will allow the population of emerald ash borer to thrive. As long as there are live untreated trees, the population will grow. One myth also is that there's only one effective treatment for emerald ash borer, and many people say it's the trunk injection of emmetin benzoate, which is, it is true that this is the most common, efficacious, because it does it provides 2 years of coverage of your tree, but it is not the only treatment. There are several. So there are soil applications and bark applications, and there could be different reasons for different applications. We'll go through those in just a second. Back then, people were pretty convinced that treatments didn't work, but we know now that treatments definitely do work. We have 99+% efficacy as long as we are treating in a timely manner. And then another one was that treatment is too expensive. It's actually pretty affordable now. So this can actually be as low as, I don't know, $6 to $10 a DBH inch, and that's talking cost to the client. I will reference the tree injection bid specs best management practice in a moment, but it is definitely affordable. if you play your cards right, plan properly. And then another concern was that treatments were bad for the environment. And obviously there's always a concern with chemicals. We want to be good ecological stewards, but the fact of the matter is, in these circumstances, a lot of times the use of pesticides outweighs a bunch of trees dying and having to remove them. But again, that won't always be the case. You need to do your cost benefit analysis, which I will discuss in a moment. Okay, so like I was saying, there are actually a few different options that have shown really good efficacy. So a few things that you kind of need to know to differentiate these options. So imidacloprid and dinotefuran, those are the two top. As I mentioned earlier, those are both neonics. There is a slight concern about having neonics out there. You can run into acreage limits if you're talking about large amount of trees that you need to treat. But one nice thing about ash trees specifically is that they are wind pollinated. So the concern around pollinators and treatment on trees is not the same as for like a really heavily flowering tree that's attractive to bees like a linden. So with Zytect or imidacloprid, one thing you need to know is that it has slower uptake and translocation throughout the tree. So it can take up to like 90 days to get up into the tree. So you're gonna have to consider that when you're doing applications. If you do an early spring application of Zytect, it's not gonna have really high amounts of active ingredient in that tree by the time the larvae start to move around. So if you can make sure that you're getting in at the right time, that's gonna be really important. So really, really early spring, I think, is our most efficacious data. The one nice thing about imidacloprid is that's really, really cheap. But please note, you must use double the high rate, so you follow the label to get good efficacy using that. Transtact, our dinotefuran product, that has quick uptake and translocation, also lasts for a year, same as imidacloprid, but the concentration does dwindle after about 120 days. So it goes up quickly within like 30, but it does dwindle after about 120. So that's something to consider. You want to hit that right as the larvae are starting to emerge. So it has peak ingredient as those larvae start to chew through the vascular tissue. And then the advantage of that is it can be done as a bark spray or a soil application. So bark sprays, as you guys know, probably are very fast. And then mectinite is our product. It's unmectin benzoate 4%. Immediately taken up into the tree, lasts for 2 years, but there is certainly consideration around trunk injection as far as damage to the tree, which I will talk about a little bit closer to the end. So important to note too, with the two imidacloprid and dinotefuran, you're going to really only see best efficacy with trees that are less than 25 inches, so smaller trees. If you're looking at bigger trees, you're definitely going to want to go for the injection. And then there is something to note. You could use those two applications if you're kind of early, EAB hasn't quite gotten to you, and then as you know that it's gotten within 15, I think they say 15 miles, then you could switch to your trunk injection. And then also on the back end, we get this question a lot, like when can we stop treating for EAB? And the answer is like at this point, you can't, but we're learning more. But you could go from doing that every other year injection to a soil application, so you don't have to damage that tree as much once you've kind of made it over the exponential death curve. All right. There's me, perspective from the trenches. I like this picture because it is indicative of the chemicals that were around back then. One of the first iterations of M-mectin benzoate was restricted use and required 2 sets of eye protection when you were mixing. So I don't ever want to have to do that again, but eye hazard was a huge thing, and we've made things better so you don't have to do that. But it looks really cool. So, tree crew. All right, here's like my story of this. So it was difficult to utilize our resources properly. It negatively impacted and skewed our financial plan for the year, and the removals were challenging. And I'm going to talk about this. So in 2014, the tree care office that I was working with won a large 2-year multi-million-dollar park district removal contract. So that was the Humboldt Park, among other park removal. We were super excited because we thought it was going to boost our numbers, right? Millions of dollars for our office. That was going to be great. It was going to give us the opportunity to hire more people, but we did not account for how hard it was going to be to utilize our resources. We didn't have unlimited quantities of chip trucks, chippers, material handlers, cranes, and then, right, because those are your limited resource. And then you can't just go and buy all new chippers and equipment for a 2-year contract, right? That stuff's super expensive. So what it actually meant is that we didn't have as many resources to allocate to our regular clients, and we could really only hire a couple of extra people. So we ended up sacrificing the commitments to many of our other clients. So folks that are homeowners associations that had, large bid specs where we'd come and prune half their trees one year, half their trees the next year, whatever it was, things like that. So we ended up sacrificing them, which was really not in alignment with building our core services, because at the end of the day, when that contract was over, it was over, and that was a removal. There was nothing else to take care of after that. We ended up making an extremely small profit margin, something like 3%. It was abysmal, and ended up not really being worth it. It also ended up skewing our, I don't know if you guys are sales arborists, you've seen your sales numbers. It ended up skewing those for the following year, which created a ton of stress to hit our numbers. So when if you're dealing with a corporate company, they won't necessarily take your large contracts into consideration. So this was super challenging, and something we weren't really expecting. We just got really excited to see a multi-million-dollar contract get accepted by us. And then I will note, removals were really challenging because they were in high pedestrian areas in the middle of some of Chicago's largest, most visited parks. Some of the trees were stone dead, so they were just turning into dust in front of us as we took them down. We were wearing respirators in 90-degree heat, high humidity. It was probably one of the worst jobs that you could get put on, and it, day after day after day. And that was the issue. We literally did this every day for 2 years. And obviously in the winter, I thought it was better, but some people think winter work is worse. So you weigh your choices. But then that creates tension amongst your crew leaders and your groundsmen and your climbers, your bucket operators, whatever, because they don't want to get put on this job. And then all of you tree workers know that there can sometimes be a little bit of drama. So that was what we were dealing with. And then what ended up happening is that our corporate office actually forbid us from bidding on the next set of removals because it wasn't financially worth it. So I guess what I will tell you is that this is a lesson for you to really crunch your numbers before you bid on contracts like this. Make sure you're not going to lose your shirt, because it's challenging. It was definitely challenging. As a plant healthcare technician, so I worked both municipal and private contracts. Back then, tree injections were pretty difficult. The hourly rates were kind of bad, and we struggled to win municipal contracts. Okay, but what I will say is it is much, much, much better now. We have a lot more, we have great tools, great products that make this a lot easier to predict. So I'll talk about that in the then versus now. But basically, being a plant healthcare tech in the earliest iteration of products, amectin benzoate products and equipment, wasn't super fun. So we were using a plug system with a hand push gun. The chemical, when it first came out, was the same consistency as a molasses, and then squeezing your hand with this gun, one of our guys got carpal tunnel from it. So it was bad, and it would take forever to set the plugs, forever to hand push the product into the tree. And then we did end up getting a newer iteration of high pressure guns, but then you would end up blowing out the bark on the injection sites. So that is certainly something that is concern, and I will also address that later. But my hand was always cramping. We wore knee pads every day. We got super creative on how to like wiggle ourselves under trees and to lie down in a way where we could hold the gun in a way that wasn't gonna fatigue us, bending over, hunching over, being on our knees. Like I said, we struggled to get good hourly rates despite what our arborists were charging. So sometimes then we struggled to get the work because other competitors were able to offer cheaper prices out there. And we also struggled to win municipal contracts, and I will talk about that in a couple of slides. So as a sales arborist, and again, I'm going to talk about the then versus now in a moment, but these were the hardships that I'm reliving right now with you. So sales arborist, I was a groundsman and a secondary tree climber and a plant healthcare tech for a few years. And then I got promoted to being a sales arborist or a consulting arborist. So there was a few different homeowner scenarios and conversations, municipal contracts and pricing conversations that kind of come up. Okay, so I'm going to go through some homeowner case studies. So kind of the three major case studies that I would see. So scenario one would be to call and treat right away when there were no signs of EAB. Scenario two, to call and treat when the tree had less than 30% dieback. Scenario three, when the tree already was more than 30% dieback. And like I was saying, 30% dieback is kind of our tipping point for treatments where we would just recommend removal. It's not worth treating if it has more than 30% crown dieback. And then I'll also go through sort of a fourth scenario, which is it's not so cut and dry. So scenario one, this is one of my clients in the north side of the city. Call to treat right away when there were little to no signs of emerald ash borer. We recommend using the toolbox approach based on the tree factor. So if it was small and you didn't have EAB yet, you could go with the soil application. But this case, this tree is pretty big and valuable. So we did a trunk injection. And the typical outcome is in this scenario is success. This is a huge ash tree. It was really important to the homeowner. I know that we were looking at it being like, oh my God, it's so close to the house, but it's their only mature tree on their site. You can't see their whole yard, but it's their only mature tree. So here we paired our injection of emectin benzoate with cultural maintenance. So we did do a decent amount of pruning to get it off the houses, take any dead wood out. Compost, water, we did cable one of the branches, just keeping it less stressed, less risky to homeowners. And we did a annual evaluation to make sure that it was always looking good and healthy and didn't have any signs. That was super successful, and it looks pretty lovely for a city ash. Scenario two, treatment while the tree still has less than 30% decline. So you're going to want to do the cost benefit for treatment versus removal based on tree factors. This actually is a different house than the last one, and I'll show you the top on the next slide. But you can see really valuable tree it's super close to the house, which I know makes a lot of arborists nervous. But when you're talking about city trees, this is their only one, a ton of shade, a ton of privacy, really important things for Chicagoans. And this is what the top looked like. So not too much crown dieback. We did end up going in dead wooding. But the one thing I did want to mention about this, so the tree survives and has some aesthetic deficiency. So can go in, okay, so what did I say on this? We had been treating this tree since 2010, every 2 years with emectin benzoate. But then we were doing an annual evaluation. I went back and looked at this tree in 2018, and there was a little bit of trunk decay in the midsection of the tree. And we believe that it was due to some old EAB larva tunneling and weakening that structure. So that was kind of at the top center of the tree. So even though this tree lived, we still need to really look at it and discuss whether it will need to be evaluated for risk assessment and removal in the future. So it doesn't necessarily save the trees, but we did definitely prolong the life, and that does matter in some circumstances. But again, that cost benefit comes into play, whether that does make a difference to someone or not. Okay, scenario 3, client is called after 30% declined. We recommended removal. That's a city tree though. So, but there are special circumstances, which is why I'll bring you into scenario 4, where it's not so cut and dry. So this tree exhibited more than 30% decline. The client wanted to just top out the dead stuff, remove the dead stuff, and still treat the tree, which we did, even though we told them that it wasn't necessarily going to save it. There's still probably larvae moving through that canopy. That's just going to allow it to die a little bit more. But the reason why becomes evident as soon as I click to the next slide, which is that their backyard and patio is exclusively shaded by this tree to a pretty hideous alley filled with dumpsters and wires. So recognizing that things are not so cut and dry, they would rather leave a sprouting small stump there to block their alley. That's totally legitimate and makes total sense. So having a realistic conversation with the homeowner and setting the expectations is very important here. Okay, so how do you get homeowners to treat? So Emerald ash borer actually gives us a really unique opportunity to cull the surviving ash trees and to save higher value trees. So low value trees, so doing the cost benefit for the homeowner and then setting realistic expectations for long-term costs and outcomes. So it gives you the opportunity to remove low value trees. So like maybe like pretty scrappy ones or ones that are jammed in between a fence and your garage, trees that are near utility wires, any trees that have structural problems or in the wrong location just in general, ones that may already have declining health from something different, or removing small trees while it's still really inexpensive. And then it's important to note that a homeowner may deem a tree valuable even when an arborist may not. And you guys are all familiar with these scenarios, but it is important to work through those conversations when considering treatment. What is the value to the homeowner? What is the cost to treat it? What is the cost to remove and or replace? What is the level of emerald ash borer pressure? Those are all things that you're going to want to consider if you're going to determine whether a homeowner should treat. Okay, so now I'm going to move into a few municipal case studies. I don't know if we've got municipal city arborists on here, but this is a pretty tale of 4 cities, but it's pretty jarring to see how different folks handled things. And I'm really just hoping that this gives you the opportunity to recognize that if you are still pre-EAB, you have a really good opportunity to make a choice. So we'll talk about Village of Arlington Heights, City of Chicago, Village of Mount Prospect, and City of Naperville. 3 of these, I was directly involved with the contracts in some capacity. All right, so Arlington Heights, the city did not treat any ash trees. They launched a public awareness program where they would put ribbons around the trees. They offered a $50 cost sharing treatment for parkway or boulevard trees to slow the death curve. But ultimately it was too little too late. They only offered the cost share program for 3 years. And then what ended up happening is that all of their trees, 13,000 ash trees, pretty much died all at the same time. And they took out an $11.5 million loan to fund the removal of those trees. So, kind of a failure, but they made that decision right away. They made the decision not to treat the trees right away. And that is a decision that you can make, but if you are going to make that, you want to definitely start staging your removals ASAP. And I know if there's any folks from the Minneapolis area, you guys are definitely living in a tale of 2 cities there, because one city opted to remove all of their ash trees and one opted to treat all of their ash trees. So just, it is what it is. But please don't do what they did and have 13,000 dead ash trees all at once. That is a huge public health concern. Again, we didn't really know better though, so. All right, City of Chicago. This is my old street. So emerald ash borer was confirmed June 2008. Before emerald ash borer, it was estimated that the city had 85,000 city ash trees and 30,000 private ash trees. The original city plan was every treatable tree would be on a 3-year cycle at the low rate. And I'm going to talk about this. Admectin benzoate is labeled to last for 2 years. But if you can knock back populations, or if budgets are really, really high concern, doing this on a 3-year cycle isn't unreasonable, especially when you're talking about 85,000 trees. So they went through, they evaluated all of their ash. If there was no basal damage, construction damage, yada, 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 or too small to treat, they put it on the list to be treated. They removed all of the ones that were deemed necessary to remove, which is great. So as of 2019, there were roughly 52,000 ash trees left. They had removed 33,000, but only a few thousand per year, because as we said, that was from 2008 to 2019. So only a few thousand trees per year, which for their massive tree crews was not insurmountable. And then as of 2019, that was the last year of their injections. And this is something really, it's important. You don't necessarily have say over it, but it is really interesting. There was a new mayor that was elected. So what ended up happening was that the political climate change, and it's not to blame a specific mayor, but the political climate changed, and they went through budgets and they went through funding, and their emerald ash borer treatment budget was cut. So as of 2020, no more ash trees are being treated. So that leaves 52,000 untreated ash trees. They are hoping that the population of EAB will decline, just because they were able to kind of, blast a bunch of the population over the years. They are working on some biocontrol studies with some other folks, and then they're always banking on a cold winter to knock back the populations. But basically, this is a discussion about managing the mortality rate. So I think they were trying to go in and at least have a discussion where they would be able to treat some trees just to keep them from dying immediately, so they don't have so many trees to remove at once. So ultimately what they ended up doing is elongating the time of the death curve, but that was at a huge expense. Treating that many trees is really expensive. So just something to consider. Trees will now be removed as they die, and homeowners will be responsible to treat parkway trees, and you can indicate that you've been treating your trees by getting these tags. So at least you do have the option to save the trees if you want, that are adjacent to your property. And then they haven't released anything to the public, I don't think, or no, they did. They released a statement to the public about their parkway trees. And then I know there are some arborists that were going through and just letting them know, like, hey, we can treat your trees for you. So hopefully some will remain, but certainly that's a large population of trees to consider. And then I'll talk about the 13,000 trees in the city of Chicago Park District. They were all removed and replaced. So this is a classic example too, that governmental bodies are completely different. So city of Chicago, so Bureau of Forestry is completely different from the Chicago Park District, right? So they were able to get the budget. This was tens of millions of dollars, hire extra laborers, outside contractors, including me, to remove these 13,000 trees. But this was because they were able to make a case that this was a public safety hazard. They weren't going to be able to deal with it in a timely manner, and the risk was too much. So they were able to get this in action, but they lost a lot of tree benefits. And now you go to those parks and there's a lot of tiny little trees that they put in to replace, which is great, but it's going to take a really long time for that canopy to regrow. All right, Village of Mount Prospect. Okay, so this is a small village, so that makes it a lot easier, but they did an early detection program to look for EAB in the early 2000s. They did a full evaluation. So they had about 2,000 trees, just under 2,000 trees total. They removed about 900 of the trees and then chose 800 legacy ash trees. That was based on location and the status of the tree. They offered free permits to treat parkway ash trees. So that's a really nice note. If you are a city person, offering free permits to get them treated does save a hassle for homeowners and tree care companies, and will allow your canopies to get protected more easily, in my opinion. And then they were actually able to obtain several grants to help cover the cost of inventory removals and planting. So you folks can consider that, look into grants that exist for things like that. And they really wanted to oh, so it was a $15,000 federal grant that helped cover the cost of their inventory management plans, as well as removal and planting. So for a small city or a small village, that's pretty good. And then I did speak to this forester. It was a couple years ago at this point now, but they were still treating all 800 trees, and all except for a handful were still alive and being treated. So I would consider that like such a reasonable success story. Again, it's a small amount of trees, but that's something that we could really learn from. And then the city of Naperville, I was on this contract directly for quite a while. They had almost 15,000 ash trees to be protected. They started in 2012, and they removed 1,400 trees immediately because they were deemed that they already had structural problems, or were not in a good spot to begin with. So great way to cull your population. And then they used their paper to get the word out there. So it's 2021 now. So you guys have the capacity to use your social media outlets to get the word out, right? So you can use the paper, that's great. But also you guys have the huge advantage of having Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever, things to get the word out for things like that. So they created a bunch of publications about this, and then they also created a qualified vendor list for homeowners, so they could identify right on there who the arborist, certified arborist in their city was, who they were, and then what the treatments options were, whether they were accredited. There are certain things that they could go about, and I think that's just like a really great idea. You just put out information to all of your tree care companies, ask if they're going to be able to do these treatments, and then you get them all organized in a list. That way people know. And there was great community partnership. So encouraging citizens to treat their private ash trees, talking about herd immunity to keep the pressure down as much as possible. And I think Cliff talked about SLAM a lot last week, but slow ash mortality. So it's the same kind of idea of herd immunity. If you can get a bunch of protected trees, the emerald ash borer population can't build as high. And they were also one of the early adopters of getting bid specs working in real life. So for city contracts, they had particular specs for which product, which method was going to be used on all of their city trees. And then they used GIS and GPS tracking to make sure that they were getting done. You had to click. I was on one of these contracts as a plant healthcare tech, so I had a little GPS thing to follow. It came on my truck with me, and then we took a little dot every time you treated the tree. So it was really nice. There's a ton of tools out there. Okay, how do you get municipalities to treat? So create a management plan. Easier said than done, but create a management plan, educate and outreach. So public officials, decision makers, private citizens all need to be involved in the education component. Inventory and assessment. So if you all don't have ash inventory and you are considering, or you are going to be on the edge of emerald ash borer, that's something that needs to happen first and foremost. And then defining, because you need to define the scope of the problem. How many trees do you have? And then establish an economic conversation. How much money are you going to need? And we have a fellow, Jeff Hafner, who has been helping with this in the Twin Cities area. And I believe he is presenting in a couple of weeks, or otherwise his webinar is online, that talks about this kind of stuff. And we're more than happy to help talk you through some of those things. Management plan, decision-making, and then treatments. Decide what chemicals, what rates, what equipment can be used, and stage removals for later budget cycles. And then also talk about removals and replacements. Okay, so then versus now, a little bit of hope before I end. So, all right, before 2010, there was a pretty large lack of consensus among scientists. This was probably just due to lack of data and because EAB wasn't really widespread, it was still new. So in 2011, there was finally a multi-state university extension fact sheet that was released. So this was the Coalition for Urban Ash Tree Conservation. And honestly, even this took a while to infiltrate down to arborists all around the country. Arborists who were not in the thick of EAB were not attending webinars, they were not attending seminars, they'd see a random thing, they were like, oh, EAB, whatever. And then the rate and spread, where it was spreading, it's not 100% predictable. So folks had heard of it, but they didn't really know about it. I would guess this is comparable to the East Coast having spotted lanternfly. If you are in the Midwest or the West Coast, you have heard about it, but you're not actively learning about it a lot because it's not directly impacting you, and that's okay. But anyway, back to EAB. So nowadays, arborists who haven't dealt with EAB know about it, and there are a lot of even like layman, regular non-tree people know about emerald ash borer. Even out here on the West Coast, people know about it because they've heard about it happening before. There was also no long-term data back then because it had only been around for a few years, but now we have like 20 years of data. So great things as far as strides in scientific data. Then as far as best management practices, again, didn't know a lot about this. I want to highlight really quickly, we have the best management practices for tree injection. This was released in 2016, and we are actually, I just finished editing the newest version. So it's produced and published by ISA and then reviewed by folks all over the industry. So this is something that you guys can use, but basically back then bids had a wide range in prices, dosage rates were not stated, timing was not specified, applications were not specified. There was no requirements for contractors to map or locate trees. Nowadays, tree injection BMP includes all of this stuff, including a section for municipal bid specs. All right, products and equipment. Okay, so this just is to emphasize injection chemicals. I want to mention a couple of things before I get into this because we have made strides with other products. So with dinotefuran, we now have water-soluble packets that can cover more diameter inches for trunk spray, so they save you money, save you exposure with loose chemicals. Also with imidacloprid, we have a couple different iterations that we've specifically formulated. We got EPA labels, specifically so you can treat more trees and not violate any acreage limits. But then on this slide, so talking specifically about emamectin benzoate 4%, back then the first iteration, like I said, was horribly viscous, really slow uptake, and tedious cleanup. So 38.4 viscosity it's oil. And it was oil-based versus now we have something that's water-based. So that also kind of goes with slow uptake to fast uptake. And then when I first began, the first emamectin benzoate product was restricted use. Like I said, 2 pairs of safety glasses. And then now they were able to get it to a warning label, but now it's only a caution label. So we've made this safer for applicators as well. And this is all folks in the industry that are involved with chemical distribution and creation. Then they're exclusively the only real option out there was using a high pressure system, so 300 plus PSI with plugs. Now we have lots of options, plugless, low pressure, and everything kind of in between. So you actually have options. You can bid different things into your bid specs that gives more opportunity for your contractors or even for your plant healthcare technicians. And equipment. So I think that was already on the last slide, but there's just some pictures. So as we first began, it was super tedious to get it set up. You had to drill a hole first, go around, set a plug, get your product ready, then go around and hand squeeze that gun. That was terrible. But now you have options to have a system that's lower pressure. You can just pump it up and leave it. You don't have to use plugs. You don't have to tap those in. You can literally go around once, drill a hole, stick the T in and leave it. Lots of time on your hands and knees before. Now it's really not so bad. And I will make a quick plug for plugless technology. So as we know, wounding and drilling is damage to a tree no matter how you slice it. Using drilling and plugs over multiple years of treatment can definitely degrade the tree over time. Trees can survive, but they may just develop structural deficiencies. So I talked about this earlier when I was talking about the toolbox approach. Ideally, we only want to be using trunk injection technology for, a few cycles. So if that's every other year for 6 or 8 years, that's 3 or 4 injections. And then maybe you can space it out to every 3rd year, depending on what the data says. Or you can switch to a soil application or a trunk spray. Once we've kind of like diminished the population of EAB as they're doing like in Michigan and Ohio now. And I also want to note here with plugs, the plug was invented as a crutch for the syrupy version of emmectin benzoate. But because we have better products now, it's really not needed. And the reason I bring this up is because I was completing applications and selling applications that could have already had 5 treatments. So some of them had a horrendous amount of damage from plugs and injections in general. And a lot of times with the plugs, they don't get calloused over or they get pushed out. Or like I was telling you before, if you don't set them properly, they can blow the bark and girdle the tree over time. And if you guys have done injections, you have seen this. Unless you're an absolutely perfect applicator, which let's just say there's a lot of room for human error. And so then the pictures on the bottom kind of show how the plugs often end up looking on the left versus a singular drill hole. So we know how biology works of the tree. To get good uptake using a water soluble product, it won't harm your trees as much. It will save you time setting the plugs, not to mention the cost of them, reduce the amount of room for human error. Like I said, those big wounds, it's human error based, and will save you, I just said that, save you money on the actual plugs. Okay, I also want to say this is in Quincy, Illinois. If you look at this picture, hopefully you can see that is a ton of bark blowout. So contractor in Quincy, Illinois was hit with what we're calling kind of like a PR scandal. Majority of their emerald ash borer treatments showed long-term damage after using plug and high pressure equipment. So if you do use this, that's, allowable, but make sure that you are doing it properly, or because at this point you're going to have all of those trees that you were treating are now girdled or damaged so much that they're going to fall victim to, secondary onset of decay or become structurally unsound. So you essentially paid money to treat your trees, but instead you harmed them instead of saving them. Definitely want to avoid that. Okay. Overall lessons learned, we know that treatments work. We have a lot of data and research to show efficacy. I didn't show any of those slides here, but I'm happy to send anything to you that you need. This comes at rates that you can use to stretch your dollars, the toolbox approach, depending on your pressure, size, location. We have a better idea of how long we need to treat for. We know that we can switch treatments once pressure is reduced and hopefully can keep the pressure down. We know how much you can charge as a contractor to still be competitive, but to turn a profit. And if you guys need help with that, please reach out. That's part of Rainbow's job. We have better products, non-neonic options that work long-term, lower viscosity, higher water solubility, faster uptake, win-win for everyone. Better equipment, low pressure, less damage, faster uptake. And then, those are the main overall lessons learned. And then from there, any questions, you can put those in the Q&A box. I want to highlight really quick, we do have some more webinars coming up into May. So please feel free to join us for any of those. One of them is in EAB tree injection demo, if you guys are interested in the field. And then there will be a survey to fill out after. And then I'm going to put this up really quick. So Pennsylvania pesticide applicator credits. I'm going to pop this in the chat right now. But with no further ado, I'm going to go back to my slide.
Yes, Allison, we do have a question here from Stephen asking, and it's going back to when to treat and what the threshold you used for when a tree is perhaps too far gone. He says, did I understand you correctly that you used a 30% cutoff of canopy thinning? Most sources I've seen, including and Rainbow has said this, is that up to 50% canopy thinning is acceptable. I understand that a good outcome may decrease as canopy loss increases, but was there something specific that caused you to use the 30%?
Yeah, so that's a good question, Stephen. 30% is what I would, and I think some of our rainbow stuff even says this, but I think 30% is kind of 25 to 30% is what is included as something that you can like turn around the tree. So you could, with pretty good confidence, say that you're going to have good success with it. Once you get to 30 to 50%, you can still certainly treat a tree, but I would not guarantee that the tree will have good survivability and good health long term, if that makes sense. So I would say the 30%, and I don't know where I think I got that from Dr. Sadoff. So some of the other research publications out there. But that's certainly, you're correct. It's not to say that something with 50% you couldn't treat, it's just the verbiage that you would use, like guaranteeing versus this is sort of a last ditch effort. I don't know if that makes sense.
And Alison, I think what may also be pointed to is it's a very subjective measurement of 30%, 40%, because, you know, my perception of 30% might be 40% for you.
Totally.
And certainly in experience, you know, once you get beyond 50%, the likelihood that the tree will survive and recover, even with a direct injection, goes down precipitously. You know,
Yes.
Certainly it's not that it can't be saved, but that the probability of its survival goes down quite dramatically. But 30%, it's much more predictable.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for jumping in, Chris. And then one thing I do want to note too is a lot of times when you're popping up to those trees that have not been treated, say they only have a 30% canopy dieback, but it depends what time of year you're looking at it. So if you're looking at it at the end of summer and it has 30% dieback but has not been treated, the larvae have been eating the vascular tissue of that tree the entire season. So what you're going to see next year for dieback is not evident yet, right? So it's a little wishy-washy. It's not so cut and dry. All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions, we are at the top of the hour. So I thank you greatly all for being here, for your attentiveness. Hopefully some of you learned something, or at least this was entertaining. I'm looking to see where some of you folks are from. So we do at least have a few of you from the West Coast. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully this is helpful to you. For those of you who are in the Midwest, we appreciate you being here, and maybe you have some of these experiences. Feel free to reach out to me or Rainbow if you have any questions. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.